Every year, right around this time, there seems to be an unspoken agreement we all seem to make. Why, a new year means new energy, new focus, new motivation. January arrives and suddenly we're supposed to be better versions of ourselves. Better organized, more patient, more disciplined, more spiritual, right? How about more intentional? Because it seems apparently that January 1st seems to flip a magical switch where suddenly we love planners. Any of you use a planner? I do. We wake up early. We feel inspired to change everything all at once. And yet, here we are. Some of us are still figuring out what day of the week it is. Do you have that problem this week? I did. Some of us haven't quite recovered from the holidays. That's a given. And some of us are already tired and the year has barely begun. I can hear, I know, some of us relate to that really well, right? Because there's just something about the start of a new year that seems to quietly turn up the volume on the word should. What should we be doing? Who should we be becoming? And how should faith look to us right about now? And before we realize that we're not being drawn toward life, no, we're being driven by expectation, driven by routines, driven by obligation, driven by voices, some loud, some mumbled, some subtle, that tells us what faith is supposed to look like if we were just doing it right. And that's why we're beginning this year with a series. And the series is called Drawn In. Because the life God dreams for us is not powered by pressure, but holy desire. Not sustained by guilt, but actually by wonder. And it's not driven by obligation, but actually drawn forward by love. So this morning, we're going to begin with this theme called dream. Dream. Because before there is action, before obedience, before we even change, there's imagination. A few moments ago, we heard Jesus stand in the synagogue of his hometown and read from the prophet Isaiah, a vision filled with good news, healing, freedom. And actually, there was some hope in there as well. And those words were not just for new listeners. They were ancient words. Words that were spoken into generations who have known exile, loss, and even longing. So rather than repeating what we've already heard, let's pay attention to what this moment is really revealing for us. Because you see, Jesus doesn't begin his ministry with a list of expectations or even instructions by that means. No, he begins by naming a vision, by giving a dream of what God desires for the world. And Luke states that Jesus has just emerged from the wilderness. He's been tested, he's been tempted, and he's been pressed to prove himself. In each temptation, it pulls at the same thread. Use your power, secure your future, and show the world who you really are. So in other words, be driven. Driven to turn stones into bread. Driven to prove authority. Driven to grasp control. Because each temptation asks the same question, but in different ways. Will you act out of fear, or will you live out of trust? But you see, Jesus refuses to be driven. So then we're told he returns home. He goes into the synagogue. He stands to read, and he opens the scroll. And what he offers isn't pressure, but actually promise. A promise. Good news for the poor, release for the captive, sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed. You see, the year of the Lord's favor. And then he just sits down. Then we're told the room grows really quiet. And every eye is fixed on him. And Jesus says one sentence that changes everything. Today, the scripture has been fulfilled for you. Did you get that? He didn't say someday this is going to happen, not eventually, not once everything is fixed or you guys get your act together. No, he says today. This moment matters, not just because it launches Jesus' public ministry, but because it actually reveals the heart of God. And this is also what the season of Epiphany is all about. You see, Epiphany is not about something new being created, but about something already present being revealed. Like a light is turned on, a truth is spoken. And what has been forming quietly now becomes visible. And in this moment in the synagogue, Jesus is not becoming someone new. He's actually revealing who he has always been. God's dream, long held and long hoped for, is finally named. And it's not done quietly, it's actually done out loud. And once it's revealed, nothing can remain the same. That is not God reacting to the world as it is. No, that is God declaring that the world was always meant to be. And here's something that we don't always say out loud at church, and that is, every action begins with a drive. How about every action also begins with desire? You see, we don't act without wanting something. And I don't mean to be negative about that at all, but hear me out when I say this. We don't act without wanting something. Because even when we act out of fear, out of habit, or even obligation, there is still desire underneath it. A desire for approval. A desire to avoid conflict. A desire to keep things from falling apart. And there's even that desire not to disappoint others. Which means the question is not whether desire shapes our lives. No, the question is, which desire is shaping us? You see, even way back in the beginning, Genesis tells us the earth was formless. It was void, chaos, darkness, emptiness. And not once did we ever hear God panicked. God didn't panic. God doesn't rush. God imagines. God speaks light into being. God dreams life where there was none. And God calls creation good. Not because it's efficient or even productive, actually, but because it's alive. And creation is not God checking off tasks. Creation is God expressing longing. See, when humanity was formed, we are told that we are made in God's image, which means imagination, dreaming, envisioning, hoping. It's not a luxury. It's actually a birthright. But somewhere along the way, many of us learn to distrust it. We learn to be practical, right? How many times have you been told, just be practical? What are you thinking of? And we learn to lower our expectations, and we learn to call survival faithfulness. And we learn to manage, let me say that right. Yes, we learn to manage instead of imagine. And over time, faith becomes less about wonder and more about maintenance. Am I hitting the heart there? Some strings there for some of you? Because we stop asking what brings us alive. We stop imagining what could be. And we stop believing that change was possible. That's why Jesus' words in Luke 4 are so unsettling. Because they refuse to let suffering be inevitable, and they refuse to let injustice be normalized, and they refuse to spiritualize pain away. See, Jesus isn't describing a distant heaven. No, he's naming God's intention for the life here and for now, which is why people are drawn in. And sometimes, honestly, they can be threatened by that. Because honestly, dreams always do that. Because the life that brings you alive, the moments where you feel most fully yourself, most connected, most awake, the life is not separate from God's will. it is often the very place where God's Spirit is already moving. Things are happening. And that's why Jesus doesn't say, here is what you should be doing. He says, this is what God has always wanted. And then he invites people to step into it. And for many of us, that's difficult. I say that because somewhere along the way, we confuse faithfulness with exhaustion. Have you thought of that? We learned that being faithful means always being busy. That saying yes was holier than saying no. And that caring more was a sign of commitment, even when it left us depleted, resentful. And we learned to admire endurance more than joy, and sacrifice more than imagination. And I'll be honest, that is really something that I still have to pay attention to for myself. As a pastor, I can fall into the belief that I'm not really doing my job unless I'm constantly working. Oh, I better be doing something when someone comes in the office, right? Heaven forbid if I'm reading a book. We're not paying you to read a book. Look busy. Because I think in my mind, and you all don't say that, trust me, I'm not trying to start anything. Nobody says that, but internally you feel that. Because if I slow down, if I'm not busy, if I step away for a moment, then maybe, just maybe, people are going to start talking about me because they're thinking I'm not pulling my weight around here. Did you see? She was reading a book the other day. But think about that. I'm just using me as an example, but think about that. We feel that way. Or if we don't do enough, people are thinking, oh, they don't care. Did you see that? They turned their back at that. They didn't even smile when I was all excited about this. Because for a long time, me personally, I felt I needed to ensure people to know that I was working. Like whoever would even give me a time, a day, I would sit and give off a list of what I was working on. And I know that's more me than you, but that's just the way it felt. And if faithfulness had to be proven through constant activity, well, then the truth is the way of living makes it very hard to rest. And even harder to dream. Think about that. And I know, I shouldn't say I suspect, I know I'm not alone here. Because many of us carry that same quiet belief that our value is measured by how busy we are, by how much we produce, by how much we carry, not for ourselves, but what we carry for others. Whether it's work, whether it's family, whether it's church, or just expectations that we just placed on ourselves, we keep moving because stopping feels too risky. And we need doing what needs to be done. And we keep showing up and we keep holding things together, but somewhere along the way, we stop asking. We stop asking whether what we're doing is actually giving life. Or is it just simply keeping us busy? And that's one of the most subtle dangers of being driven instead of being drawn in. Because when we're driven, we may still be doing good things, but we're no longer doing them from a place of love. We do them from fear. Fear of what might happen if we actually stop. Oh, if I stop doing that, then what's going to happen? It's all going to just fall apart. And then we also have fear when it looks productive, slowly draining our soul. And that's why Jesus' decision to begin his ministry with a vision is significant. Because he doesn't start by fixing everything. And he doesn't begin by confronting every injustice head on. No, he begins by naming God's dream. Because without a shared dream, even good work becomes hollow. The religious leaders of Jesus' day, they were very busy. They were very disciplined. They were also very committed. But they had lost sight of God's desire. They were driven by control instead of compassion, and by defense instead of possibilities. And Jesus disrupts all of that by reminding them, and even us today, if we're paying attention, that God's heart has always been oriented toward life. Not just survival, not just endurance, but life. And that distinction matters for us as individuals and also for us as a church. Because churches can be driven too. Think about it. Driven into tradition, driven by fear of decline, driven by the pressure to maintain what has always been done. And when that happens, we can work very hard to protect something that no longer brings us life, either to us or even to the world around us. But the church was never meant to exist for its own survival. See, the church exists to participate in God's ongoing dream for the world, which means part of our calling, especially at the beginning of this beautiful new year, we need to stop. We need to really start asking ourselves not only what we are doing, but why. There's that word. Why are we doing it? And whether what we're doing is aligned with God's desire for healing, freedom, hope, dreaming. I love that word, dreaming. It's not a distraction from faithful work. It makes faithful people work possible towards the dream. Because when we stop dreaming, we default to obligation. And when we stop imagining, we settle for what is manageable. And when we stop listening for God's desire, we rely on our own habits instead. But when we allow ourselves to be drawn in, when we listen for what gives life, something begins to shift. Energy returns. Purpose clarifies. Community deepens. And suddenly faith feels less like something we carry alone and more like something we are invited into together. So let me ask you, not to answer out loud, of course, and not to rush past it, but really honestly, please sit with this week. What brings you alive? And not what just keeps you busy, and not really what earns you approval, and not what you feel obligated, well, I have to do this, but what actually moves your soul. For some of you, there was a time when faith felt alive, when prayer felt honest, not just something I have to do each day, and when worship actually stirred something profound, when service didn't drain you but actually filled you. And maybe over time, that spark dimmed. And not because you stopped believing, because I don't believe that, but because you became driven instead of drawn. Driven by responsibility, driven by routine, driven by fear disguised as faithfulness. But the spirit that hovered over the waters at creation has not gone silent. See, the spirit that rested on Jesus in that synagogue continues to speak, which means the church is not meant to be a place where dreams go to die. No. The church is meant to be a place where dreams are named, tested, shared, lived together. So notice that Jesus' dream is never just personal, because we heard good news for the poor, freedom for the captive, healing for the broken. This isn't about individual fulfillment alone. This is about a community transformation, which means dreaming is not escapism. Dreaming is discipleship. To dream with God is really to ask, what kind of people are we becoming? What kind of church are we called to be? And what kind of future is God inviting us to imagine together? See, that kind of dreaming takes courage, because it's easier to complain than to imagine. And it's safer to preserve than to actually create. And it's less vulnerable to say, this is just how it is, than for us to actually to stop and say, what if it could be different? But fear has never been the source of God's best work, because every movement of God begins with someone who dares to believe that the present moment is not the final word. That is what Jesus is doing in Luke 4. He's saying, this is the dream. This is what God has always desired. And today, Today, it begins. Not when conditions are perfect and not when everyone agrees and not when the sun is shining a little bit brighter. Not even when we feel ready. Today. So as we begin this year, the first sermon of this first day or first Sunday of the year, this first invitation I give you, I want to gently encourage you to notice where you may have been living out of obligation instead of desire, and where faith has become heavy instead of hopeful, where imagination has quietly gone dormant. Instead of judging, notice it. Because awareness is where dreaming begins. This week, pay attention. Identify what gives you energy rather than what is draining you. Notice what makes you feel more present. And then ask yourself the question, what might God be dreaming through me? Through us today. Because what brings you alive is not accidental and it's not even selfish. It's not even insignificant. Because as we step into the season of Epiphany, we are reminded that this is a season of light, a season of revelation, a season when what has been forming quietly becomes visible. So in the weeks ahead, may we allow ourselves to be drawn in by what gives life, by what stirs hope, and by what reflects God's dream for us, this church, this community. And as God's light reveals the way forward, may we respond, not out of pressure by any means, but actually out of the love. Because that is often the place where God's ongoing creative dream is waiting to take shape. Friends, the Spirit of the Lord is still upon us. The dream is very much alive. And today, once again, it begins. Amen? Amen. Amen.